Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss various topics of history and theology. I ask that if you would, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Help me get these educational videos out to a wider Catholic audience. YouTube is fond of only promoting the worst of our interests, and the quality content gets buried. The only way to correct this is if you, the watcher, engage with the video, so please subscribe, please like, and if there's something you'd like to say, leave a comment. Today, the tone that we will take will be of a more somber one as we discuss the awful events surrounding the wholesale slaughter of Constantinople's Italian minorities in the 12th century. In order to make sense of the atrocities and why they were so particularly violent, we must first consider the events taking place in the East and West in the centuries leading up to them. Maybe the most drastic event outside the founding of Christianity in the first millennium is the emergence of Islam out of the Arabian desert. This new religion purported to be the completion of revelation through a caravan prophet who said he had received messages from God. While the Islamic armies burst out of the east into Latin North Africa and up into Gothic Spain, it more immediately marked out a physical chasm between the Greek and Latin-speaking worlds that threatened to undermine what lasting peace had been sustained up to this point. In the midst of this, statists, which could be roughly considered the equivalent of national politics today, were emerging around the area of modern-day Eastern Europe, especially Bulgaria. As the Slavs were coming into the Christian fold, they would find themselves, figuratively and literally, in the middle of the conflicts emerging between Rome and the so-called New Rome, Constantinople. In ecclesial matters, this reached its apex in a schism between the Byzantine Patriarch and the Roman Pontiff, known as the Phocian Schism, named after its antagonist, Patriarch Photius. While this schism was reconciled even before Photius' own death, the lasting bad feelings were not about to go away. The Byzantine Greeks in particular began to formulate these long list of grievances that they had against the Latins as they were coming to know them. From matters concerning how the Latins, that is the Western Christians, baptized, how their priests shaved, the incorporation of the filioque, which is and the son, as it would translate into, the use of this in their local creeds, as well as the use of unleavened bread. These lists stand as a stark reminder of just how tenuous the communion between East and West had become. One of the major contributing factors to this growing resentment was the rise of Western autonomy, brought about first by a pact made between the papacy and the Frankish court that begins with the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in 800, something which the Byzantine Empire especially came to resent. In a somewhat unrelated series of events, William of Aquitaine's charter for a monastery in Cluny began a process that would eventually culminate in the great Gregorian reforms of the Church, wherein the papacy excised itself from secular powers and became an autonomous power, both temporally as well as spiritually. This would lead to the apex of papal powers in the High Middle Ages. Contrasting this with the Caesaro-papism of Byzantium, it's clear why the Easterners may come so to resent the papacy. This resentment would find its unfortunate culmination in the mutual excommunications of the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1054, ushering in the beginnings of the Great Schism. But it wasn't clear to anyone at that time just how deep this schism was until the events of 1182 unfolded. In the 11th century, the rise of the mercantile class, advances in farming, and the rise of medieval cities paved the way for new international economic ventures. Venice is one of the most industrious cities with skilled artisans unequaled anywhere else in the world. Many monarchical courts, Christian and Muslim, East and West, wanted good trading relations with Venice as it only brought in revenue to their own. The Venetians, for their part, were always well aware of their power and their influence, and would harness it to the resentment of many. Throughout the middle 12th century, the Byzantine court tried to woo the papacy back into a reunion through a series of campaigns and alliances that never garnered the hoped-for reunion. As a result of these overtures, the Byzantine emperor ended up on the bad side of the Venetians, who would for years consider themselves at war with Constantinople. By 1081, the Byzantine state seemed to be on the verge of total collapse. Between a series of invasions and the never-ending civil strife, New Rome threatened to flounder under the pressure. While throughout the 12th century, the Byzantine emperor's power remained relatively strong, he was increasingly undercut by the now firmly established aristocracy, who had created a bureaucracy that no emperor could afford to offend. In a whirlwind of intrigue and violence, things finally began to somewhat settle with the ascension of Alexios Komnenos in 1078. Alexios and his successor Manuel managed to bring the empire back from the brink, but at many high costs. The Byzantine treasury consistently ran at a deficit, and all of the emperors of this period were heavily preoccupied with revenue, especially in paying for their military. Like old Rome, Constantinople came to rely heavily on mercenary armies for their protection of their borders. Alexios I, looking about for potential revenue, would turn to the Genoese, the Pisans, and the Venetians in particular to entice them with trade agreements to bring their ships and their business into Constantinople. These agreements would be the genesis of resentment, as it gave the Latin traders a competitive edge against the local merchants. You can imagine the emperor's dilemma here. On the one side, he needed the revenue to fund the empire and keep it functional. On the other, his citizens were becoming increasingly hostile to the presence of foreigners who would come to create their own quarters in the cities, as we shall see. Aside from just traders, the court also brought in Latin soldiers. Manuel, for example, was known to prefer French knights over any other, including his own Byzantine army, and began to place them in powerful positions in the court. Emperor Manuel dies in 1180, having left no adult heir. In the interim, as his young son Alexios II was waiting to come of age, Manuel's widow, Maria of Antioch, was to act as regency. Maria, like Manuel, was highly favorable toward the Latin minority in her city. She, like Manuel also, knew the importance of keeping trade agreements. Added to this complex situation, Manuel had arranged for his son, heir to the throne, to be betrothed to Louis VII of France's 8-year-old daughter Anna, who was brought to the city in 1180. The hope here was that it would secure ties between the East and West, especially with France, but it had the unintended effect of making the populace even more paranoid and jealous over the Latins in their country. Meanwhile, to the east of the empire, a rogue cousin to Manuel named Andronikos was threatening to invade the city and take the crown for himself. For a time during the last years of Manuel's life, Andronikos was sidelined, but after his death, the would-be usurper began to coalesce a resistance. Constantinople was a city of extremes. On the one side, for example, to the far northwest palace in Blockernay, there were scenes of rich imperial opulence, with gardens and fountains to spare. On the other side, the streets were dark, narrow, and cramped, with poor and increasingly destitute citizens. These citizens were looking for a scapegoat, and the monasteries, who were vying for independence, provided them with one. The upper class of Byzantium, especially in Constantinople, tended to be very well educated and cosmopolitan. They were happy to import ideas, themes, commodities from the West. Manuel, for example, brought in knightly-style tournaments in the imitation of the Franks. The lower class, though, tended towards extreme poverty and ignorance. Most all the pleasures of their life they could enjoy were derived from their liturgy and the monasteries that were in close proximity to them. As you can see, the northeastern half of the city was divided into quarters, where each port came to represent the Latin states who docked and traded there. These quarters are akin to, say, a Chinatown that one would find in the modern-day United States. It was at these ports that the Latins established for themselves what they assumed was a relatively permanent residence in a friendly city. After all, the Orthodox population there, though in schism, still viewed the West as but separated brethren. So they thought. With the death of Manuel and the interregnum regency of Maria, the position of the government was becoming untenable. Outside the city walls, powerful landowners seeking to claim their own independence were often the greatest perpetrators of causing internal strife within Constantinople. A Constantinople caught up in its own conflicts tended to be less inclined or able to bother outside the city, and landowners had ironically turned their own peasants into a serfdom. Factionalism became more and more pronounced in this period. The powerful landowners outside the city came to rely on the Latin merchants within the city to buy the olive and the wine they produced. The native merchants within the city came to resent the partiality showed by the government and the preference from the landowners toward the Latins. Yet there was no effective means that these native merchants could call upon to address their grievances, so increasingly they came to press the arm of the ignorant masses, telling them through the medium of their beloved monks that it was the Latins who were to blame for all their misery. To add to the complexity, going back to the hostilities of the 1170s, technically Venice still considered itself at war with Constantinople, even though it had a portion of its merchants still working there. Manuel's death also sparked a cascading series of rebellions on the outskirts of the empire, which internally threatened the legitimacy of Maria's regency. If she couldn't get things under control. In an ill-fated move, though, she began an affair with Alexios the Protosebatos, the son of her deceased husband's brother. This Alexios, who tried to rule with a heavy hand, was unliked by everyone, including by many Latins. By the 12th century, the Byzantine Church was effectively an arm of the state. The Ecumenical Patriarch, as he was known, could be elected or deposed without explanation or justification on the whims of the government. While accepted by the churchmen at large, on a lay level this was often protested against. Some monasteries, ironically called free, were subject wholly to the emperor, while others attempted to gain autonomy, and it was these that usually had the ground support on a popular level. These monks became notorious for certain demagogues among them who would harness the mobs into the streets to violently push through whatever cause they were pursuing. In 1176, the tax-exempt status was withdrawn from the monasteries. Then, in 1181, Alexios attempted to quell their hostility to his government by reinstalling their status, in turn hurting the revenues of the city. What ends up happening is that the local middle class of the city, who had come to rely on those taxes, were in turn becoming hostile. In response to this, Alexios sought out help from the wealthy Latin population to intervene. The result of this intervention into local politics had the almost immediate effect of creating a very aggressive and potent contingent into a faction almost exclusively based on their anti-Latin stance. Constantinople was sitting on a powder keg, and it just needed an ignition source. Another Maria, Maria Comine, Manuel's daughter, tried to overthrow her stepmother's regency and was forced into hiding in the Hagia Sophia in February 1181. The Patriarch, Theodosius, fearful for his aiding of the princess, refused to go on the Easter pilgrimage on April 10th for the traditional kiss of peace with the emperor. The citizenry was in outrage over his absence, and rumors of a plot against the city began to take hold. In this vacuum, the anti-Latin party was particularly effective in scapegoating the Latins as the primary suspects of a coup which would place the heretical West in power. Mobs led by priests carrying icons, crosses, and holy banners began moving across the city, slaughtering opponents of the princess. Anyone deemed friendly to the regent government was a target. Though this uprising was quelled, from the distance, Andronikos was being fed updates of the revolt and used this opportunity to assemble an army. In the spring of 1182, Andronikos had his army waiting outside the walls of the city. Alexios, in a stalemate, would eventually lose his entire fleet in a mutinous act when they won over to Andronikos. Resistance collapsed. Andronikos, a populist leader himself, had been busy making overtures to the mob, especially the anti-Latin party, promising them the full opportunity of a wholesale takedown of the Latins in the city if they helped them, which they willingly did. He sent a contingent of his soldiers into the city. It was a predetermined signal that he was allowing the anti-Latin party the chance to kill with impunity every Latin they could find. The slaughter began that night, April 1182. Any attempt to explain the level of depravity displayed by the Orthodox mob against the Latin minority will simply come off as sounding hyperbolic. But all sides at the time agree that the slaughter was unprecedented in its brutality, even for a city so raked with mob violence historically. The mobs descended upon the Pisan and Genoese quarters and began killing everyone. The choicest victims were the elderly, the women, and the children. The madness of the violence must have been exacerbated by an already cramped quarters the Latins had been living in. All over they were dragged into the streets from where they slept, beheaded, raped, slayed. When the victims fled to their churches, the churches were set alight with them inside. The screams of the burning women and children were said to be heard from those who had successfully made it to the ships and out to harbor. Mobs entered the hospitals and systematically cut the throats of the sick in their beds. Unborn children were seen being cut from their mother's wombs. The Latin cemeteries were ransacked, with graves being exhumed and corpses left mutilated and hanging. A particular level of cruelty was reserved for the Latin clergy and religious. Nuns were the principal target of rape. The execution of the clerics were delayed for as long as possible to extend the torture that could be inflicted on them. Cardinal John, the Pope's emissary, had his head attached to a dog's tail. In all of this, it was the Orthodox clergy leading the charge, pointing out the Latins and hiding to the mobs. They especially took thrill in destroying the remaining Latin altars. Some Latins tried to flee to boats which were in turn burned in the docks with them aboard. Any Latin left in the city after the initial violence had subsided were captured and sold to Turkish military as slaves. No one is quite certain the actual death tolls. It was certainly in the tens of thousands. Some say as high as 60,000. In the days leading up to the slaughter, some friendly Greeks had been warning the Latins of the dangerous situation they were in. These brave souls helped some flee the city before the onslaught. As the few survivors managed to get on the ships and flee the city, they collectively joined up and began taking vengeance on the scattered Greek islands they passed on their way back to Europe. Greek monasteries became a particular target, considering the sheer appall that they had felt by the role of the monks in the city towards them and their families. Latins had to come to terms with just how far their Eastern former brethren, who they assumed were brethren, had come to despise them. As a result of this night, the Byzantine economy collapsed, and Andronikos was murdered in 1185. There becomes a palpable resentment in the West, in particular among the Venetians, about this incident. Yet it would be too easy to draw an artificial line between the events of 1182 and the subsequent hostility the Latins had against the city in 1204, when the crusading army ransacked Constantinople. The events of 1204 were born out of a separate series of circumstances, unrelated to the events that led up to this massacre. But there should be no doubt that the level of violence attributed to the Latins against the Greeks should be read in light of the first blood drawn by the Greeks towards the Latins. We will never know if the Venetian army would have been just as violent had the massacre of 1182 not happened. But there is a real retributive sense one gets when you read the accounts of the Venetian Crusaders going through the city and who their targets were. One thing is certain, the Catholic Church has faced her past many times since 1204. The Greeks are always quick to point out the atrocities committed against them. We Catholics have hung our heads in shame at this act towards those who we should have considered our separated brethren, despite the fact. The highest bishop of the Catholic Church, the Roman Pontiff himself, in 1201 wrote a letter to Archbishop Christodoulos apologizing for the atrocity. And again, in 2004, in a personal meeting with the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, he apologized. It is a certain sign of a Christian humiliation that led him to deliver this apology on our behalf. But one has to wonder if at any time during this meeting, if it ever crossed the Ecumenical Patriarch's mind, the year 1182. 20 years after this act from John Paul II, an apology for the wholesale slaughter of the Latin minority is still forthcoming. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I will see you next time. God bless.